cup of tea.
Hi, good evening and welcome everybody to our UdK Tuesday number 234. Today with Pooja Agrawal. I hope I'm saying your name right, but I leave it to Professor Bada to introduce our guest today.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and a very warm welcome to Pooja Agrawal. I'm very happy that we can be here together digitally today. It's a link that takes us to London, UK, and a kind of quite different way of city making from a Berlin perspective. And I always tend, like in a kind of conversational tone, I like to say that London is ahead of Berlin. So that it is, I'm always grateful for sort of this let's say, experiment of city making on the island for everybody else to observe and learn from it from a distance. You maybe know that Berlin is at the moment heading for a referendum to, how do you say that, verstaatlichen, communalize some of the big housing companies. So this question of who owns the city, how do we together create a city, and how do we think of co-create our common future in the urban environment? I think that's a very fundamental question. And coming from architecture, we're all involved in the kind of continuous writing of answers, or let's say theories about this question through our practice. And this is where I'm particularly happy to have you, Pooja, here as a guest today, because I imagine that your biography can, let's say, give us some, or you could taking us a little bit through your biography, different attempts or different roles or different scales of you personally being involved in and responding to these fundamental questions of how can we make a more fair or more common good oriented city together. And now, because I'm bad in memorizing these facts, I will read a moment from your bio. Pooja is a co-founder and incumbent CEO of the social enterprise Public Practice. She is also the co-host of the diversity platform Sound Advice. She's an architect and planner who worked as a public servant at Homes England and at the Greater London Authority. She previously worked at design practices including Publica, We Made That, and Tects. She's a fellow at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose and an associate of the Quality of Life Foundation. She has previously mentored at Fluid and Stephen Lawrence Trust, taught at Central St. Martin's, and was a trustee of the Museum of Architecture. She was nominated for the Planner's Woman of Influence in 2018 and 2019. And already from this very short bio, I think it stands out that you've been working as a public servant, as well as an activist, as well as an advisor and planner. And I'm very excited and looking forward to your input today. Welcome very much, Pooja.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I couldn't think of a better introduction about how I feel like my career has always been about how to create a fairer city. So, with that, I will just start my presentation. So give me 1 second. And hopefully you can all see it nice and clear. So thank you. So as Marcus says, I guess I trained as an architect, and my interest has always been how can architects work in different ways, and how can you move beyond this very traditional idea of who an architect is. I never wanted to set up Pooja Agrawal Architects. I didn't think that was the right route for me, and through university, I always found myself sort of struggling to define myself as someone who just made buildings. So today I'm going to talk about how over the probably about just over 10 years, how I've tried to practice as an architect in different ways. So as an urbanist, as a public servant, and as a change maker. So an architect as an urbanist, I think for me, in some ways is very obvious, but place and people have always been the most important things to me when we're designing. So I've always been interested to think about beyond the building, you know, what is the wider neighborhood, who lives there, who is going to live there, who is going to be impacted by some interventions we make. I've been interested in the relations of power, of politics, and advocacy. So one of the first places I worked for was an architecture and urbanism practice called We Made That. And why I was interested to work there was actually they only worked for public sector clients, and as a mission, I thought that was a really interesting approach. So they were very clear what they wanted to do, and they were also interested in looking at the city in this kind of wider scale. The kind of context, political context in the UK, or actually in the London at the time, was just after this was around 2012 when the Olympics was coming to London. So there was all of this money, which for this word regeneration, which you hear a lot in this kind of UK context of investing in cities to make it a better place. And with this investment, there comes questions of, like I was saying earlier, how is it being invested, what is happening, who is being impacted by this, and so forth. So as an architect, I was looking at this area. It's called Waltham Forest, which is like a municipality. So London is split into what we call local authorities, and one of these local authorities, Waltham Forest, is very close to where the Olympics was happening. And so all of these different municipalities got some investment, and in a way it was kind of up to them to think about how are they going to invest in their local in their areas. So I was looking specifically at this place called Black Horse Lane, and what was really interesting there was that it was a very industrial area. So it had, like, you know, all of these like steel being produced. There was like terrazzo, kind of big physical stuff, but there was also at the same time like a funeral parlor, but there was also a high street, there was also homes, and I guess the council were thinking all of this investment is coming, there's a huge housing shortage in the UK, this housing crisis has continued, and we can talk about this more. I'd love to hear more from your context as well, but so homes are going everywhere. So how do we bring more homes into an area which is very industrial and is seen as kind of dusty, dirty, and how do these coexist? And for us, and We Made That, we were really interested in the high street, you know, these kind of shop fronts. This becomes a space which brings different people together, you know, where you go and buy your milk, where you go and have breakfast, where you go and maybe buy a property at the estate agents. But somehow this kind of brings together the whole of the neighborhood, and quite simple, what seems like very simple interventions of designing these shop fronts and you know, improving that, bringing these what feel like quite scattered little shops into one, feeling like one street, actually had quite a big intervention. But actually it spent so much time just talking to each of these people, getting to know them, making them feel like a community, and thinking about how do you build this resilience? If there's change going to come, how do they adapt to the kind of changing demographic as well, and take advantage perhaps, and not see it necessarily as a threat. The other thing that was quite interesting, like I was saying, was all of these different aspects is happening on quite a big street, really long. So where do you intervene to make a bit of change? And we were interested in almost creating like a civic center. And that first slide I showed with this little kind of cafe, we realized that that was an interesting space which actually brought together lots of different communities, from truck drivers who would stop there and get their £1 tea, to there were some artist studios and they would go and get a bacon bap, which is just a bacon sandwich. I promised to try and explain the Britishness in this talk. So we just, through very simple things, we designed and installed this really big clock, which for us felt like almost like a civic statement that this is an important place. We improved all of these pavements in the corners. We created these big signs which showed all the different businesses that existed here, because one of the things, you'd be walking down the street, you just don't know what's happening behind closed doors. So through design, these little interventions, we were revealing the things that are actually important in the city, and that shouldn't just go away. But at the same time, how do you start to adapt these places to lots of different types of typologies and different uses? Next slide. Along with the kind of physical and the hard physical things, we've always been, so I guess I've always been interested in the people, the soft things, like how can you, at the same time as painting a shop cover, a shop sign, how can you actually think about the economics of that? And so we actually held all of these sign making workshops for local people to actually kind of build on the skills. And we, you know, commissioned an artist to photograph all of these amazing things that are being built behind closed doors, but we just don't know about, and put them on these huge billboards all across this very industrial area. We commissioned another local artist to do this huge gable design. So it's this kind of combination of the hard and the soft, which is really one of the really interesting things I learned from we made that as a practice. Alongside this, as an urbanist, I think research is a really important aspect, and a way of kind of gathering evidence. I think there's sort of two ways that I've sort of been exposed to this. One is through, I guess, like a thematic research. So high streets, for example, we were doing all this work on high streets, actually giving evidence as architects, as urbanists, to show the kind of spatial importance of some of these places to people who don't have an understanding, like what the relationship is with the high street and an architect. Actually, how do you bring that together and reveal what the value is? This was an example of working for actually the Olympic Authority, the LLDC, to kind of show how could you create these new typologies of working and living places together. And again, through both at the city scale, mapping where all of these places existed, but also at a more building scale, trying to look at the different typologies of how, you know, artists live and work informally, and what does that look like, but also more formally, how it's been designed in this area, and bring this together for the local authority then to make certain decisions about policy. Another approach was at Publica, where I worked for on and off for many years. Publica was set up by Lucy Musgrave, and one of the, you know, she's an incredible force of nature, and it was very much about it's a place-based research, I'd say. So this is an area in London called Bank, and the city, the local authority, asked Publica to do some research to tell them what to do with the public space. That was the brief. And actually what we did is, over a long time, we sort of mapped the area, everything from every single class use. So what is it in terms of planning? What are the different, I don't know if it's the same, but this is a commercial space, this is a retail space, mapping all of that to actually the much more human things. Is like, it's 1 o'clock at lunchtime. It's a very office area. So where do people tend to cluster and sit and have lunch? Or you'll find this particular corner of the street, because the sun hits here, this is the space where actually you should intervene and improve more, because this is how people are using it. So a very qualitative and a quantitative approach to research. And again, as an architect, as an urbanist, we have this spatial understanding, and to bring that research together and make a case for how you intervene in the city, I think is a really important, has been quite an important learning curve for me. So after having done working in the private sector, for me, I realized that I was most passionate about working for public sector clients. And I realized actually if I change the side of the table, I think I would have more influence. So some of the frustrations were that already a project was being defined and being told that you need to intervene in this Black Horse Lane area, while I was like, hold on, there's so much more thinking that you can intervene at an earlier stage to influence where is the money going for in the first place, or what is it that we should be thinking about in the first place? Is it high streets, or is it the future of workspace, or what's the future of public space? So to actually be at that forefront of thinking before the decisions are made when it comes to an architect. So I joined the Greater London Authority, which is I guess the mayor's office. There's about 700 people, so it's quite a big institution. It's a big organization, and it sort of tends to be separated into different teams that has different approaches. The team I worked in was the regeneration team. And we had this kind of place-based approach to regeneration. So the project I talked about earlier in Waltham Forest was actually funded by the GLA. So they funded those type of projects. So to touch on a little bit of scale is what I want to talk about at the GLA. So one of the things for a few years I was overseeing was Northwest London. And this constituted lots of different municipalities coming together that come together as one municipality and have certain powers to bring lots of different homes in this area. And for me, working at the GLA, it was like, what can I do to improve this this huge place? And what are the different roles you can take? So for example, one of the roles was to be a facilitator. There's so many different organizations and stakeholders involved. How can you bring all of these people or organizations together to create opportunities? So for example, you have all the different local authorities, but you also have like the railway infrastructure companies or the management of these public spaces. Actually, sometimes you find you can't do anything because there's some private outsourced company who's like, you can't build and put any trees here because who's going to manage this? So actually, you start to like be able to implement this change as a facilitator, seeing opportunities, and through the power of meetings is make lots of change. It's through people and relationships, I would say. The second is actually thinking a little bit on as a commissioner, which I will talk in a bit more detail, but finding opportunities. So there was this huge canal that ran through this area, and again, spatially, you think in public service in this team, it's like there's so many opportunities you can intervene in making this canal a more interesting place to spend time in, and what are the different things you can do there, from cycling lanes to cafes, to creating little more intimate spaces, to ecological interventions. Again, as a sitting in the GLA, you have the opportunity to find places of intervention that you can change at quite a big strategic scale. And then finally, it's about money. Money is important, and it you know, if you can intervene at the place of capital, I think it's quite powerful. So over the 3 or 4 years when I was kind of looking at this wide area, just from taking £50,000 to commission a very simple evidence, like a placemaking report for a small area, you build evidence to say, hold on, here are all the different opportunities that have been identified in this report. Why not fund this project or this project or this project? And over a few years, it was about growing this into over £5 million, which has a legacy, which has grown even more. But it's the ability to have a much longer term impact. For me, was a really interesting aspect of working at the GLA. Another aspect, at a different scale, was to be able to commission projects at a building scale. And one of the projects I commissioned through the GLA was the Granville, which is in Northwest London, in this area called Kilburn, which is parts of it are quite socially deprived, and there was a huge push to do lots of new social housing. And there was this building there which had been underused for many, many years. How could we take that and make it a better used community space? And So it was funded through the Mayor's Office, but we worked really, really closely with Brent Council to think about the importance this underused building had in connecting the wider community to the park, but also how can you start to think about a new type of community space, a new type of social space, which is at the heart of this community. What I want to talk about this is like the importance of using design as a tool to influence change. So by commissioning really brilliant architects called RCK architects, they use design to come up with lots, as you do, come up with lots of different options, which they were then able to show the politicians saying, hold on, if you did this, this is what you can do. If you were to adapt the site in this way, you can add so many homes, and this is what it would entail. But also, more importantly, we're able to work closely with the community and bring what was actually a very difficult political situation using design to bring people together, I think is a really powerful thing. This is just a snapshot of all of the different people that are involved with this building, and in some ways you can see the outcome as being quite simple. It was a mixed use, a cafe, a community space, an artist studio space, which is affordable for local people, but actually these are all the different people that needed to be brought on board, and that's not easy. There was political tension. There was a lot of local politicians had to step down over certain decisions that were made before we got involved. And I guess, like I was saying, how can design be used as a kind of political tool is something I've been interested in. And so the space opened up a few years ago, and it's being used by different local businesses to almost as an opportunity for entrepreneurship, taking up the cafe, using the community space for different uses. This is the kind of artist workspace. There's music studios at the bottom. And most importantly, it's used for lots of different community events, both managed by the local authority, by also different community groups in the area. The other way to influence as a public servant is by influencing policy. So the importance of language and words must not be forgotten. There was a program I oversaw for just about a year called the Good Growth by Design, which was really the importance of, so the Mayor Sadiq Khan kind of really emphasized the importance of design, which should seem obvious, but is not so obvious in the UK context. And had this, still has this group of 50 Mayor designer advocates. So all of these experts who basically we had the ability to bring together to be able to help some of the thinking, that the kind of wider policy thinking, having design expertise to influence that. So the London Plan is like the most important, I suppose, policy document, which basically influences of how all of London will be planned and delivered over, I guess this mayoral term, and all of this design policy sort of sat under this. So for example, there was a housing design guide. You should think it's obvious that homes should have windows and light and fresh air, but sometimes it's not so obvious when you can convert office spaces to residential homes without planning permission. So actually the importance of rules cannot be undermined in my perspective, and the importance of the public sector to be driving the importance of good design, good quality homes as a given for all people, for me, is a way that good homes is accessible to all people, regardless of their background. And sorry if you can hear my Baba crying. He's also sad about the quality of homes in the UK. The other thing, another example is about public space. So we talk a lot about the design of public space, but actually management is quite a complicated issue. And these are the things that can seem quite boring, but actually, if a public space is beautifully designed but not managed, in 5 years it's going to be a waste space. So these are the things that we need to think about upfront, and again through policy, but having spatial designers influencing these conversations is really important. I've sort of touched on high streets, and obviously we're in this position now that we have to be talking about the climate change and the impact we're having on the environment, especially as people working in the construction industry. So through regulation, how can we push people who are building on the ground to think about what impact they're having, where is the materials coming from, what is the kind of circular economy, as it were, and this is another kind of key sort of policy that was emerging when I was working there. So I've sort of given you some background of my experience of working as an urbanist and working in the public sector, and I guess it's hopefully quite clear so far in my sort of passion for the public good. And for me, it came down to how important it is to have people working in the public sector that can really influence change and make that change. And having made that journey myself, I was really interested to see how you can make that journey at scale and what impact that would have. So for me, it's thinking about how do you change the very fundamental system that we work in. So I co-founded the social enterprise called Public Practice, and I'll explain a bit more what it is. And I set it up about 3.5 years ago. And just to give you a bit more context, I was talking about the kind of condition of the housing market in the UK. So this is a map from post-war, who was delivering homes in the UK. And you can see in the first sort of 30, 40 years, that was primarily the public sector that was delivering lots of homes, and the private market has kind of stayed consistent. But you can see why we're reaching this housing crisis is because the public sector has over many years retrieved into seeing its role as being a kind of proactive player in delivering homes and providing that for as part of the welfare state. And this shows you an example of like how many planners were employed by the public sector over this period of time. And within this audience, you can see how many architects were employed, and the peak is here in the kind of 60s. We had sort of 49%, and today, pre-public practice, it was less than 1%. And for us, you know, what I'm trying to also communicate is, for me, architecture, urbanism, planning, somehow they should all be thought of the same thing. We're all trying to change the environment we're living in, but somehow planning particularly has always had a very bad reputation, even from architects, about, you know, it being boring. And this is an example of within the UK political spectrum, it's always been seen as, oh yeah, public planners are keeping the jobs locked up in filing cabinets. This was Thatcher. To our coalition government in the early 2010s about planners being the enemies of enterprise. So somehow the rules are keeping things back, to the most recent political parties we have at the moment, where, I mean, we're called nude counters, which basically, I mean, even I can't translate this because I haven't lived in this country my whole life, but I think it's about like stopping entrepreneurship and innovation, and the planners being at fault for the problems in the country. So public practice, what is public practice? It's a not-for-profit that it's a social enterprise, and it's founded to improve the quality and equality of everyday places by building the public sector's capacity for proactive planning. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So there's a board, and currently I'm sitting on the board, but in about 3 weeks, I'll be taking over as chief exec and working there full time with a team of 8 people. So the theory of change, there's 3 sort of things we do. And the main thing in the middle is around recruitment and resourcing, which is about building public planning capacity. So we basically place associates into local authorities to work there for 90% of the time. And I'll explain all of this a bit more. So basically, we're putting people into local authority, into government, to really build public sector's capacity to deliver better places. The other things we do is around communications and advocacy, sort of shifting this idea of planning being this really negative thing to being actually the solution to today's biggest problems. And the other thing is around research and development. How do we think about planning as being a very proactive thing as opposed to something that's keeping people behind? So when I talk about associates, so who are the people that we're putting into government? They come, for me, it's about people who are impacting place. So it's not just about architecture, but actually about people like engineers, people with infrastructure backgrounds, people who have backgrounds as economists, because they'll be helping us change the high street, to more about property surveying, more commercial experience, to transport and mobility, and increasingly seeing so many skills that the importance of having kind of sustainability expertise, where lots of local authorities are saying they want to be carbon zero by 2030. So you actually need these people within public sector thinking about how do you do this. So the authorities are different municipalities, and we've been operating in the southeast, but we also have people in like the Greater London Authority, so at kind of London level, or different types of public bodies, as it were. So in the last 3 years, we've placed about we've had sort of over 2,000 applications for the programme, and most people have applied from outside the public sector. So these people had never thought about working or had never even tried to work in as a public servant before. And we've had over 300 expressions of interest. So authorities also are applying to be part of the programme. So we have placed about 150 associates across 44 authorities, as you can see, and this is the southeast. So that kind of shape in the middle is London, but we have people across the southeast, and most of the placements have been brand new roles. Diversity is a really important thing, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but we have consistently always pushed the boundaries of what is terrible statistics for architecture planning and surveying, for example, and that too in gender as well. One of the most important things is that almost 90% of associates have chosen to continue working within the public sector after their 1-year placement. So for us, that is this big victory of really building the capacity in the long term. So we're making an impact. And even though it's a 1-year placement, people sort of use it as just kind of put their toes into it. But once they're in, they're like, actually, this is a really amazing opportunity, and have tended to continue to work in the public sector. Just I'm really aware of time, so just really quick examples. So for some of the things the associates have been doing is empowering communities, working much more with local people. So this is 2 associates across different cohorts working together, setting up a community review panel. So building the capacity of local people to actually understand how you read plans, and bringing their local expertise to have formal input into all of the new developments that are coming into the area. Other things they've done is around raising design aspirations. So the word design can sometimes be quite a scary word for the public sector, or it can be expensive. So how do you actually build people's understanding of what that means? And in Hounslow, we've had over multiple cohorts, again, working within the council for the first time. They'd never had any design expertise. And in the similar way, I was talking about the Mayor's design advocates, they've built expertise that help influence the big planning applications, but also they do tours with their colleagues to really brilliant projects to say, this is what we mean by good design. And by actually experiencing this, you are able to see things that seem very obvious to us might not be so obvious to people who don't have design backgrounds. Climate emergency, obviously a really important thing, and Enfield is one of the municipalities that's taking a leading role, and Rafe and Tilly have been working on this, and Rafe actually was working at Foster's, and they're doing this huge master plan, and they want it to be completely sustainable. So over the next 20-25 years, they're working from without anything on the ground. They have the ability to be really forward thinking about how you intervene in Enfield. So I spoke about I'm just looking at the time. the associates do research. So every other Friday they come together and work on a whole variety of different themes. This is what it used to look like. This is what it looks like today. But it's a really it's important for the cohort to come together. And some of the biggest problems we have seen is that people are all trying to solve quite similar problems and don't talk to each other. And there's a power of the network of these associates who you'll find, oh, so-and-so and so-and-so are working on high streets and town centres. How about us, we join together to try and solve these problems in a way that maybe local authorities wouldn't have spoken to each other before. And Slack is another tool that is used by the associates to really keep in touch. At the end of the year, they all have a little practice note. They're really, really practical things. It's not meant to be this academic research, but actual, like a spreadsheet with some examples of how the spreadsheet can be used to help the design process, for example. So this is where we've been operating at the moment. And my challenge as chief exec is to build a kind of national program over the next few years. And you can sort of visit the website for more information. And if you're happy to bear with me for a few more minutes, I wanted to talk about people and the people who are changing the city. For me, it's the lack of diversity in the industry is really, really shocking. And I used to not speak about it so publicly before because I never really wanted to be pigeonholed as this is my expertise. But a really good friend of mine, Joseph Henry, and I used to work together at the GLA. We were quite interested in how can we talk about this in a way that can capture people's imagination, so people just don't roll their eyes every time we talk about diversity. And this is a few years ago. So it kind of came a bit accidentally. We were asked to write an article for After Party, which is this incredible publication, to talk about diversity. And we were thinking, hold on, how do we make this engaging? How do we make this in a playful way? And so we sort of came up with quite provocative slogans and linked them to music. So we sort of found it as a different way to take quite what can feel like quite a difficult subject and make it and be provocative and create a space of discomfort to be able to have some of these conversations. So this is an example of one of our slogans. We during lockdown last year, we had what we called a visual podcast where we talked about social inequality. So who is being most impacted by COVID, and used sort of music videos actually as a different form of aesthetic and culture to kind of talk about these things. So we're basically trying to expand the aesthetic, the references, the cultural contexts of architecture. We had an award ceremony where we celebrated people who wouldn't so obviously be celebrated by architects. So the community activist, the self-builder, the climate activist who's a lawyer. We kind of created a spectacle and celebrated all of these people, and there were real tears. People were really emotional, and it was a really amazing experience. So what we're doing at the moment, as of this afternoon, I've just got delivered 1,000 copies of this book that we've pulled together. It's we've got exactly a year ago, we after George Floyd's murder, we were sort of quite disillusioned by the response by the industry, and we asked our kind of wider network to ask them to respond about how they would sort of provoke change. And we've put together these 50 essays or provocations. Some of them are little plays, some of them are poems, some of them are little spoken word. And this book, is going to be launched in a couple of weeks. And again, we've asked the contributors to come up with the slogan and link a song with their text. And you can follow us on Instagram. So just to conclude, and I've thrown so much at you, I guess for me, what's driven me is like being quite clear about my purpose. What is it that's really important to me? And I hope you could see that thread running through all of my work at different scales and through different roles, whether it's a public or private practice. I think it's important that we push boundaries, whether it's the boundaries physically to the boundaries of the system and how you can actually intervene and make change. And finally, it's to think about privilege, be kind of aware of the privilege we hold and all of us hold, and how we can make space for people who have less privilege than us. So I'm going to stop there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Pooja. That was an amazing quick tour through through a lot of different aspects of working as an architect. Thanks a lot. I think, Helene, it's now your turn to moderate, right?
I will just quickly hand over the word, I suppose, to Mariana and Elena, our two students who will begin to ask the questions.
Yeah, so my first question is more specific about the public practice. And you explained that the public practice is this independent social enterprise. And I wanted to know how open is this communication between the authorities and the associates or the public practice team? And if you want to choose a new project, like how open can you talk to them about it? Or is there a hierarchy?
I'm sorry, my baba is really sad, so you can hear some screaming in the background. And I guess the question is like, what role does public practice take? I guess public practice acts like a bit of a facilitator. So it's trying to connect the local authorities and the associates. And I guess we push the local authorities to think about what the opportunities are. So I guess that's what you're kind of trying to get to, like what projects you're working on. So it's not just filling a job that existed already, but it's working with the local authorities to say what is the potential of a role in the first place. So we push the local authorities in that way, and then we have this really interesting application process where there's lots of different rounds that, and I won't go into too much detail about how we shortlist people, and then we match. It's a very complicated process that I will soon learn more about, but we match the different people and skills and what they would like to build in the year with the kind of opportunities of the local authorities. So within a year, in some ways, I guess it's like you can be super ambitious, but it's also limited to what you will be able to do, and it's been taking a bit of a realistic understanding of what that is, and the team provides incredible support to the associates, but there's also like a wider network of mentors, for example, that we facilitate and create. So and the cohort itself become this really interesting support within themselves, and the research becomes a space to perhaps push things within your local authority that you think you'd like to explore a little bit more. So that's another space where these interesting conversations and interventions can happen with different partners.
Okay, then I would have another question. First of all, thank you for your presentation, for your lecture. It was really interesting and also inspiring. I read on your website that you're also concerned about the safety of women in public spaces. And on that regard, I wanted to ask you if you follow a specific strategy to solve that problem.
You mean me or public practice?
Maybe in general.
In general, yeah, it's a really good question, and it's very live conversation with the kind of tragic murder of Sarah Everard that you might have heard of a few months ago in the UK, and it has definitely raised lots of questions and concerns about the safety of women. At the GLA, I was involved with something that actually has grown into a piece of work around it. I think there's so many different basis to intervene, and I think that intervention needs to happen at different scales. So in the way that I've kind of talked about all the different tools, there is like the kind of large scale policy of thinking when you're making these big decisions about how cities are designed. We need to firstly have diverse people of different backgrounds making those decisions, and I think that's really, really important, and making sure that voices are heard at that scale to be able to think about our lived experiences to influence how the cities are designed. So there's that kind of policy side and policy scale to much more kind of local interventions about how people feel, how women feel safe in these spaces. So I mean, there's really interesting. There's a new book by Leslie Kerr called Feminist City, which actually talks about this in a really interesting way. And yeah, I think that there does need to be more work done in this space about what it actually means, because I think it's different for different cultural contexts as well. I don't think just lighting can solve the issue, and how some of it is a physical change, some of it is about how we all behave in society. So how as architects and designers do we start to kind of impact that, influence that? And I think that, yeah, lots of different ways you can intervene.
I have another question, or do we?
Sure, go ahead. You can ask yours first, and then we'll ask the other.
So I'm thinking about the COVID-19 situation, and it affected especially those people who live in informal settlements because of the lack of basic sanitation, also social distancing. And I wanted to know, how did you dealt with this crisis, or how did it affected the behavior of some discussions or some authorities?
I think it's a really interesting question, and there's so many different ways to answer this. In the first instance, the way the local authority operates, I think, is interesting to see how in some ways the public sector is seen as this like big, heavy, slow machine, but actually when COVID happened, the local authority quite quickly had to respond, and people from different departments were suddenly working in food banks or working in a very quick response to respond to the situation, using high streets, using local community centres to form these connections with people more directly. So in that operational side, it's been very inspiring to see how the public sector at the local level has really kind of tried to respond. We're sort of moving now to this recovery stage. And again, I guess different local authorities are adapting in very different ways. So one of the Marcus, in my introduction, said that I'm part of the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, and that's run by Mariana Mazzucato, who is this amazing economist. And we're working really closely with Camden Council, which is a municipality, to think about how is this moment used to rethink the economy, and what does that mean spatially. And some of the things we are looking at specifically are around social housing, around kind of food poverty, around sorry, to stick with the food poverty before I move on. It's again thinking actually all of these things are spatial problems. So and I think quite often we're not in these conversations thinking about how do we tackle food poverty in the UK, but to be able to think of these systems, spatial systems, and think about how you influence that. So yes, I can talk about social housing and I can totally influence that conversation, but actually us to be at the table talking about the kind of food poverty, for example, is a really interesting moment. So for me, the local authority, that public servant, the opportunity is to be able to think in the longer term, even though that's not always the privilege they have, given the austerity, given the lack of funding sometimes, or the constant pressure to do things, or politics. But I think with COVID, you're seeing very fundamental things shifting, and some local authorities using it as a way to kind of tackle some of the bigger problems, and poverty is going to be a huge problem moving forward. So that's the kind of big society issue, but more at a kind of place scale, all the conversations are like, what's the future of the town centre, and these high streets and retail? Are the kind of big, the Amazon's going to completely destroy that? So what is the future of that? I'm interested in like, what's the future of public services if food banks becomes is a place where people are going to? How can you actually start to think about different public services like job training and job opportunities being linked to food banks? Or, you know, how do you start to bring all of these? What's the future of a community space, for example? And the more obvious ones are like, you know, the future of work and offices. Is that going to fundamentally change the way cities are designed? And I mean, we can talk about this for hours. There's I don't know if this is a temporary kind of push because of Brexit as well, but we're seeing a bit of an exodus from London. So what is the future of the kind of city versus rural versus town, and how do you plan for that? I think is a important, interesting debate that needs to happen, or is happening.
And do you think this shift of behavior is something momentaneous or something that will stick in the future for like to prevent also some other crisis, or just something that that's just for now?
I mean, the big obvious crisis is around, you know, climate and the impact that's going to have on how we live fundamentally. And in a way, you could say that this has been coming in something drastic was going to happen, where we would have to fundamentally change our behavior and learn how to adapt quite quickly. So in some ways, I hope it's given people the kind of being forced to tackle some of these things that we see as a long-term problem, but actually we need to really tackle it now. And we're seeing lots of local authorities really wanting to tackle this crisis, and like Manchester City Council, for example, are really tackling this head on and have lots of different ways they're kind of thinking about it at a building level, about how you retrofit buildings so that they're more energy efficient, to creating much more sustainable public transport links. So hopefully this long-term thinking continues and is built on. And it's important for us. I would say it's really important for us to be part of these conversations, because it's really quite quickly we can get excluded out of what are spatial and design conversations as well.
So I would like to ask you, thank you, first of all, for this amazing presentation, because I think it's a rare perspective that we see in our series of UdK Tuesday. And it was really interesting to listen to your points and also to the UK perspective. I would like to ask you, the question kind of has various layers, because I keep listening to you and I'm interested in how you found and find your purpose in what you do. And partially I'm also interested in, did university or your education support this path at all? Or how did you kind of find support along the way? And thirdly, how did you begin to kind of broaden your interest so far? I think it's a question which relates one to the other. I mean, maybe one or the other would prefer to answer. So kind of, how did you get into this whole realm? Like who? Okay, maybe too many questions, but this is what I'm thinking about.
I don't know. Sometimes you look, when you do these kind of, when I'm, putting this presentation together, I was like, in some ways it seems so linear. It maybe doesn't. I don't know. It's like I did this, or it can feel a bit could almost like post-rationalize it, maybe like these are the things I'm interested in. I think I always somehow architecture is building. I was always I couldn't ever see myself just designing buildings, I guess. I also worked for lots of different practices, which I didn't talk about today. I worked for amazing Ilse Crawford, who's this interior designer who's quite well known, a really beautiful, amazing, but quite luxury. I worked in New York for a while, so I guess what I've chosen to show might show a much more cleaner narrative. But I guess by testing and trying, I kind of was like, okay, hold on, I always want to make an impact on people. I think design is not an elitist concept, it should be for everyone. And this, I just learned it over time. Not always supported necessarily by university. I think that it's shifted now. I think lots of architecture universities are thinking about the urban scale much more in the UK, but when I was studying, it definitely wasn't so obvious a link. So at the time, I guess it's about finding people who would push you, and certain tutors were really supportive and some weren't. Now, I think I do think having a support network is really, really important. And over the last few years, have definitely built that within the industry. And even the community that's been built around sound advice is a really strong, like it's almost like family now, and we all support each other and push each other. And people who did that for me, I hope I can do for other people as well. And quite often, and therefore through mentoring or informally, trying to support a much larger group of people to find their voices and their purpose within what can feel like quite a cutthroat environment. So find your friends and keep them close.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I think in the German public sector, I know none of my friends in architecture who is planning to go into the public sector. So I think the fact that you mentioned this is kind of an idea for a hopeful future to make this public practice more attractive also to young architecture students, because I really know no one at all. And probably leading by example is always the best idea in order to inspire others. But I'm sure the others have questions and might want to go first.
I do have a question, and I'm sorry in advance because it's kind of a Debbie Downer question. Because I was wondering, how do you manage the economical aspects of your project to take economic profitability into account for your projects?
Which projects? What do you mean?
On the different kind of scales. So if you, for example, if you transform an entire building and you have different kind of ideas about like how to form a way of living together that, you know, connects working and living, for example, from a project that you, this one project that you showed today. I was always wondering, or I always wonder with these projects that I think are very nice and very poetic, whether they are profitable and thereby easy to kind of do and to realize, or whether this is actually a fight that you have to have with people who tell you, oh, it's not profitable or not, like, this is so far away from university and from our education, this question that I always wonder.
Well, this is why the public sector, that's exactly comes down to that. So even Charlotte's question around purpose, increasingly I realized that it is, for me, the public sector that should be driving decision making based on social purpose for people rather than for profitability. And they should have the ability to think in that kind of longer term impact and longer term revenue streams, if I'm going to be technical about the money aspect. And I think that's what was really satisfying of working in the mayor's office, for example, was being able to say, we're going to put this money into this building, which no developer is going to touch because they won't see the profitability in it. But from the council's point of view, they will be able to have a much bigger impact and get different benefits. So we call this like social value in the UK. It's like, how do you put value on things that are not capital? And the word we use here is social value. So starting to kind of put the importance of that and how, but then when you're in public sector, these interesting conversations come up about how do you measure this? How do you prove this? How can you say that from every £5,000 we put into this building, we got 3 relationships made between this community group? I don't know, like, and it becomes a super interesting challenge that is important, but it's political as well. And that's a different type of currency, but you can influence that. And I guess one of the things I talked about there was the kind of research side, like using evidence as a way to bring value to things. So for example, with high streets, the GLA did this report bringing together evidence of how important high streets are, not in their economic sense. Maybe the retail is not as important. So what? It's a really important space for community cohesion. therefore public sector should intervene and make sure that we're keeping these spaces and they're not just becoming homes, because they have a much wider value in the neighborhood, in relationships, So for me, it comes back to why I wanted to work in the public sector, was because you can redefine some of these values and it not just be commercial.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions from you, Elena and Mariana? What I was also wondering, along the path that you were explaining, sort of up and down and maybe not so linear as you presented it today, was there anything along the way that surprised you? And that surprised you in the long run?
I'm not going to tell you.
I can think of another question. That's not the problem. I have plenty. There were so much interesting things in your work. It's not a difficulty at all.
It's such a nice and ominous answer as well.
Oh, honestly, I can't think of anything without it being really cheesy. So I don't know. I can't think. Sorry.
No, don't be. What I was also wondering is whether perhaps this capacity, sort of this education of you being trained as an architect, maybe allows you to see things differently within the public sector. Like, I kind of wonder about this dichotomy of working as an architect in the public sector. How does it feel and what does it enable you to do? Where perhaps somebody who's not an architect would have kind of less foresight perhaps, or a less general approach. Like, do you see any type of advantage in actually being an architect in that field now?
It's interesting because in the 60s, when all of these architects were working in public sector, they were working as architects, like they were designing the housing that public sector was delivering, while now a lot of us are working in a different kind of way. Some people are designing buildings and delivering that, but a lot of us are, I'm not working anymore because I'm in a public practice, but are kind of working in a more kind of system way. And architecture as a discipline should teach you to think about all of these different levels or the different contexts you're working with, all of which I try to touch on today, whether it's the finance, the economics, the people, the communities, the physical materiality of places, and to be able to hold all of those together, think about them at different scales as well, think about problem solving, thinking about creative solutions. All of these are architects should have, and but not just architects. Maybe architects think they're too important sometimes, I don't know, but there's a kind of thinking, the design process, like how you think creatively to solve problems, is important, and for whom. But not all architects think about for whom, but that drives me. So it has helped me think about spatial solutions, for sure. Yeah.
I have another question that came in, and I think it did come in before you said that you also worked in New York, if I understood that correctly. So this will give an extra layer of interesting, I think. So the question that came in was, could you imagine to work in the same intensity in a different place or country? Or in how far is this kind of approach related to the place you know best or live in?
That's a good question. So I grew up so I was born in America. I moved to India when I was 3 years old. That's where my family are and still are. My parents still live there. So I lived in India, in Mumbai, which is a big urban city, from 3 to 16. And then I've been here pretty much since then, other than going to New York for a year. And then, yeah. So I have worked predominantly, I'd say, in urban. I've lived and worked in very urban conditions. And I suppose that has to date been the kind of, my practice has been kind of urban response. But with public practice, it's the impact we're making is not just about working in cities, it's actually working in very different environments. And the role I was doing most recently was also a kind of national picture. So I don't think I mean, I don't think it's necessarily particular to the UK. Perhaps there's other countries, if we talk about the public sector, perhaps the context of the public sector is obviously very different. If there's different European places like that are very strong, have, you know, like Vienna has like incredible social housing. So within that context, like maybe the intervention, the solution would have been a different thing. But, you know, it's interesting to hear that, you know, none of you would ever think about joining public sector. So yes, it's to do with the context, but also I don't often, when I've spoken about public practice all over the world, people are like, oh, this could work in Sydney and Melbourne, or it could work in Cairo, it could work in Berlin, you know. So it's for me a much more fundamental idea of the role of the state and how what that relationship is to society.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Maybe Professor Bada, you have another question or some closing remarks. I think the floor is back to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, thanks to you all. This was a very charming and but also very touching conversation to listen to and to be part of. I think especially like I could connect to the last question about the situatedness of this work that you're doing, and I was wondering or comparing it to the Berlin situation, where there is a lot of us and them, this kind of polarization of city making between public authorities, civic groups, and private interests. And there is what I like to kind of call Berlin folklore is when it's polarized to the maximum, or like when participation looks like public bodies present planning futures and the citizens are unhappy, express unhappiness, revolt, and then everybody, like, there is not a negotiation or the conversation even, it's more this kind of like a staging of being different, working in different ways, and not even being really interested in each other. So what I was super curious about is to see and follow, and that's more a comment than a question, that what you represent and also what you evolve to is a sort of mix of these and a blurring of these boundaries. So it's not so much here is the public authorities and you have to take this, you know, once in your lifetime decision after the end of studies, I'm going to go this way or that, as it sounded a little bit in the question, but you went in and then you went out again, now being something like part of a sort of civic organization, NGO, creating an interesting in-between territory of knowledge that seems to act as a translator and seems to be accepted or acceptable by both sides. And I think this is for me, that's super inspiring and super interesting. And I don't know of any kind of similar example in Berlin. Also, as in my introduction, I was mentioning the referendum for the municipalization, or I don't know how you call that, deprivatization of housing. So again, that's very confrontative. No, it's not looking for a middle way. It's really making a statement that our common good is not in the hands of the market, but that our common good should be done the complete opposite way. And I think it's super interesting to find these in between situations or ways of working. I think that would be my comment. Yeah. And that's, for me, that's a huge inspiration. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I agree. It was really great, and really great to see how the two sides can correlate and are not so distant, just like you said, because I think in our realm, it often seems to be the case.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And I will just end the stream.
Thank you.
You can just stay in this